always seem to do one about Halloween, and I thought this year'd be nothing different. I've got another video showing my house at Halloween and how much I was into it. And of course, that's through my kids and stuff. But how we used to set up the house, and it kind of gives a glimpse at it. There's one year that's not on that video there. It's the year after that was made, but neither here nor there. I'll be showing that here soon. But where a rich part, or a large portion of this comes from, is ancient Celtic folklore, and not only folklore, but something that they had entwined in their religions that led to what we have in our modern day as Halloween. It's kind of an odd thing, but it's a mixing and separation, and then becoming something quite different from each other, although having similar roots, and then getting back together and forming a third thing based on all of the above. And it's got portions of all of this area, whether we're talking about Germanic type people or the ancient people of Spain and France, or the Romans or Etruscans of ancient times, or whether we're talking about the British Isles. And even going back into a time whenever this land that's here that you see boats connecting to over here wouldn't have been able to go through there. And at best there would have been a river that runs through that portion there. And all of this up in this area here would have all been Doggerland as we hear about it, and actually people living in this portion too. There was a great catastrophe that happened. When we look at most of these holidays, we look at them in a perspective of what we're told as we're kids, and when we get older, or a lot of times it's blended into it when you're kids, you find out that there's other things associated with this whole concept. Like when you go along with the Christmas idea, and it's supposed to be, well, really the reason for the season is Jesus. And then you come to find out that, well, all the pagans had this thing with where exactly the sun does its flip around and starts coming back up, and it sits still for 3 days near the sign of the Southern Cross. So they had this concept of the sun dies on the cross. This sun that God made for us dies on the cross every year around December 21st. There's a signification to that 21st idea too, but we won't get as deep into everything or I'll never actually finish a video. But 3 days later, then he rises again to save all of mankind, and that sounds real familiar, only instead of it being the Son of God, it's actually the Son of God, and something quite different. But I guess that's for Christmas. But now we're having a Halloween situation, and Halloween is a little bit different because it's that equinox situation that we also have in the springtime. And both of these are still based in some way upon the idea of the moon in a lunar calendar. So, you know, in the middle of summer there, we had the longest day of the year, and that's the middle of summer on the 21st. But then on December 21st, 6 months later, exactly the flip of what we have is winter. And it's really not our height of winter. It depends on where you are in the United States, but it's definitely not your height of winter. That seems to happen on or after January 15th. It's actually kicked off a little bit and a little bit late every year. In fact, if it happens early, then that changes everything. But if you average it out, it has another look upon it, but of course it happens late because it has to get swung all the way there before a northern will reach down that deep, and it has to penetrate it before then. But let's not get into meteorology. But these two separate ones that are equinox, meaning equal night, meaning the difference between day and night is the same length of time, not the farthest of winter, or not the mid of summer, which is the longest day of the year. So in turn, we have the longest night of the year in winter, and then there's in-betweens. But I'm born near the Easter idea, and finding out whenever I was a kid, that's figured on the moon, and it's like okay, well, it's the third Thursday after the third full moon, and this, that, and the other, and stuff that goes along with it. Where does that come from? Well, that's an ancient pagan thing, but they've got the Bible wrapped around that idea, and that's also when that was supposed to have happened, around something that the same thing, so they have adopted all these things. In fact, you'll find that quite often Halloween has been adopted by modern people. Let's not stay on this picture too long, but this idea really is strengthened, just like you'd say Christmas is probably strengthened more by Germanic type people, even though they have connectives way back when from the Yamnaya culture and the corded ware and so on that we talked about before, and they're sweeping back in over here. But then there was a time also before the end of the last ice age, whenever the top third of this was covered by an ice sheet, and there wasn't anybody living here. They were all living farther south of this, or around the Mediterranean and farther south than that, and even in Egypt and so on. And that's the reason we find a common genetics from there. But that's not for the scope of this video, but you'll find that it centers a little bit more in on this area here, and in that area there are people that had these celebrations that we could talk about to the nth degree of how it all works out. But one thing that connects with them and the ancient them that actually used to be Proto-Indo-Europeans and so on was this bonfire concept. In fact, this actually had hookups around the Mediterranean and so on, but also well into the East. And this idea that seems to have been carried on from primordial times. Because All Hallows Eve and this concept where, because of this veil that's as closest in time, that you can be close to your ancestors, is what this is all based upon. Strange that we have this thing where kids dress up as superheroes and stuff nowadays, but it didn't used to be that way. And before we had superhero concepts, people were dressing up more as demons and so on. And there's this ancient tale that, like a Celtic rite they used to have, where they used to build this bonfire and have this whole ceremony, and then people would go to Stonehenge and have another ceremony and do this thing all night. So in the daytime, they would do this one at Woodhenge concept and then go all the way to Stonehenge. And whenever they had this concept for that nighttime, that was the end of the ritual, waiting until the sun came up, and it would be between a certain point, and the moonrise would be between a certain thing, and they knew it'd be the thing that was exactly the days that it would happen. And there was this festival that this was the center of, was a verification. They already knew was going to happen due to astronomy. They had hooked up since way back when. Hell, these people, it's well verified, knew well in advance every eclipse that's going to happen and so on, and even if it's going to be a partial or what's going to happen off of it. But that's for another video too, I guess. But there's this bonfire concept as one of many that's hooked up with the original idea that goes on here. And it's an end of harvest festival, and it seems like all these people, which I didn't mention in the last shot, which all had cattle hooked up to them and so on, these people that had brought domesticated horses into the fray and so on. And there was all these rituals that had to go along with this, that had to do with a bonfire. And even in some of these situations, they had to go with a sacrifice where you were going to kill off the evil, which also, happens to go on at Christmas in other cultures. but then it also has hooks up with the Christianity idea, where somewhere hidden in that is the concept that once per year they say they would sacrifice somebody as being the major sinner out of everybody and put all their sins upon him, but they would also let somebody go. And who do you want to let go? And of course they wanted to keep Barabbas and kill Jesus and stuff. And they like, what? Anyhow, that's not for the scope of this. We're talking about Halloween. But strangely, it has connections too, because you can also see that people had calendars at different times. Like the Sumerians had one pretty much around their spring pitch that goes on there, and other people had it around, like the Egyptians, around their time of the flood, which happened later in the year and made the crops fertile, so they always had a late rise in there. But they're closer to the equator, so they're as it's summer's fading away, it's really over the top of them and fading away much later. And I guess it's time to mention what you probably already well know, that whenever it's high of summer in the northern hemisphere, and which we just had not too long ago, but any time that you see this video, you know what I'm talking about. And the height of summer here, and the 21st and whatever, like we're talking about, that it's actually the 21st of winter there, and they're having their winter at the same time, which is strange when you figure out that South Americans in ancient times actually had this Day of the Dead. Whenever Spaniards first messed with the people of South America and the Aztec Mayan people that we know about and everything that got decimated by chicken pox and so on, but whenever we first met them, they already had this going on, this Day of the Dead. And of course they're Spaniards, but they already had it going on too, and it, instead of being on the 21st, was somehow pitched around within this 3-day period, again coinciding with these days. And it was really like, okay, when do we start the festival? Whenever we know it's coming tomorrow, or when we start it in the middle of it? Do we start it after we know that it's happened and coincided? And there's really a 3-day pitch there. It's just like the 3-day pitch that you have at winter and so on, that the sun starts rising again. And of course that's solstice, and that means the sun stays still. You know, it's strange that some of these rituals that are hooked up with them, they tell you that these people all go around it and everything, and this was signifying, well, we go around the sun and it's been another year, and has to do with the dead that are there. And what's weird about that is that it seems to be a good attachment just as long as the bonfire goes, which is way, way back in time. But then that shows you these people had this idea that we're going around the sun. Well, they're sun worshiping people in its essence whenever it started, like all of the other religions have that I've shown before in prior videos years ago. Just like over the years I've shown things hooked up with Halloween, whether it's a Dracula or a werewolf or a Frankenstein concept and things like that, whether it relates towards today or whenever it was written, or this concept way back when, and other creatures too that I've talked about too that are like in a Dungeons and Dragons world, which are actually taken from ancient mythology concepts, and a lot of which go back into this elder time that we're talking about, to a time before writing. And how far back? Well into it, because these two, and they have to merge, and we're thinking that's like back in the last ice age, certain parts of this. But also one way they can connect it is this Proto-Indo-European or Aryan linguistics. And it's like everywhere that Mary went, a lot of these concepts went, whether they changed and got a little different flavor and named different things off of seemingly ancestor veneration that went along with this concept that comes out of it. I don't want to sit and go too deep into it without being able to cover enough of it, it seems. So let's try to move along here. But in these ancient Celtic places that we see coming through time, so this has been going on for long before this, when people first started to see this and then they realized the connections, some people theorize to the point of saying, well, this might be the start of it. And it's like, this doesn't look like the start of it, does it? Then any place that we've been able to find, even post holes that are going back well into the last ice age, are seemingly lined up. And they would say, well, if they're migrating around a little bit, maybe they're facing certain places with the way they build their house. It's like, yeah, but also lining it up with north, like real good with north. So you can tell what they're hooked up to. In fact, the sun only comes down through this path and lights the thing that's just over my left shoulder. And one day out of the year, well, it's really about a 3-day period. It kind of does it, and then it does it pretty damn good. There it is, and the next day it does it, nah, and the next day, meh. So it's right there in that threshold, and that's the threshold of the door that's there too. There are times this is done with a gap stone, all kinds of different situations, but also showing you these people go back to a way back when. And this is all an artificial cave that's all been built, and then a mound put over the top of it. That symbol that's over on the left kind of looks familiar, but then it looks kind of like water or wind swirling or something along that, just like the symbols for Led Zeppelin seem to mean something in ancient Celtic rites and everything. But if we were to put 4 on that and swirl it around, maybe that'd make something. Or if we were to use that swastika type symbol, it maybe make a little more difference in the idea of sun come up, moon go down, world spin round and round. Time for another lesson. At certain days, certain things happen. And strangely, again, I have to bounce off the idea that this is a concept of a tomb and rebirth and coming forth by day and sunlight and things that are connected to all of these people, showing you that, yeah, that kind of has a connective from the Wayback Machine with sun worship and these ideas. But then again, Halloween is supposed to be ancestor veneration. Anybody that died that year is supposed to be venerated to that day, and there's supposed to be somewhat of a feast to it. And we really think of that idea now when we go into Thanksgiving, which is again like the 21st idea or the third Thursday or whatever, to make a weekend out of it, some people and everything, and all hooks up to different stuff in a modern day, been taken out of context and don't really want to go there. It deserves its own videos, which I've already done a few of, but it leads into the holidays. And oh my God, spice has been around already for weeks. They've been shoving it down your throat already. And I remember a lot of that concept. And of course, once you get those certain smells and scents, and it goes along with the certain types of the holidays here, and what we would think of as Thanksgiving. But there was a feast that goes along with this that people don't think of too, and quite often whenever they talk about this in different cultures. So it shows you it went back to before and well before and how long, and it traces back, well, in a lot of these cases they say at least 6,500 years ago and longer. Just like I showed a recent video on folklore and how that works out. But lo and behold, there seems to have been a place set for this person that no longer exists. That's real neat. Has to do with this idea where also this feast gets along, and at one time there were barns and so on, then it starts to use bigger buildings. And believe it or not, it had to hooked up with churches until the point that a lot of things like demons were invoked on the idea that they're hooked up with this and music or anything else. In fact, even into a modern day. In fact, this was about the time that Coca-Cola actually had other stuff in it, like cocaine and so on, and this was considered okay and acceptable or whatever. It was this concept that went along with it. Well, there's a lot of other concepts that go along with this that came across too into America. And you see it now in a modern day, and it got changed. And whenever I was a kid, things did change a little bit. But this idea of a huge bonfire and I don't know if you saw that last little picture. We'll try to catch it again maybe, but the man with antlers and so on. Well, we've done other videos and how that hooks up to people that used to be hunter-gatherers. It seems like that goes back in the last ice age too. But it also ended up getting hooked up with rituals that go along each time of the year, and then that's the great stag of the forest and the man as a representative of nature, just like there's Mother Nature and its concept and counterpart, its fawn. And these people dancing around this fire here, and in doing so, supposedly going around and has something to do with the sun. But there are a lot of connectives, and little ones are this concept, which is shown to be a little different here than it is there, but in the same breath, they're basically the same thing. That's why I say whether you're Germanic or whatever, and it's really something that blends all Caucasians from a Wayback Machine, showing you they had this cultural idea that still goes on today, and even though it's been blended up into a modern time and changed a little bit over time, it's really about the same thing. And it goes back from a time that, like I'm saying, people used to have these stag rituals and so on, but something that we're left two different ways of for the Celts, and it seemed like it had already been a drive thing whenever this happens, had this ancient tale, well, one of many. And it says that, well, what they did was they did something like in Superman. Whenever they finally get to his crystal castle up there in the North Pole, which is kind of like Santa Claus, isn't it? But they get up there and he knows he's got it set up to where he can turn all of his powers off if he radiates himself with kryptonite, which takes all his powers away and makes him just a weakling. But he ends up reversing it, and it only happens to them, and ha ha ha, and then she takes a punch at her and so on like that. That this idea that they were gonna get all the demons to come here and make this idea, this pact, and this supposedly is where the idea of all these weird demonic masks of death, the type of things, come along with this Halloween and fears and everything else, because it's the end of, it's not spring, and then hooked up with bunnies and eggs and all kinds of things like that, and flowers and things associated with spring, and the birds and bees and butterflies and so on. It's just the opposite of it. And it's just in your lifetime, but it's a cyclic thing. Like I say, some of these ancient tales go way back when, and to times whenever, they used to build forts like this that you can't even find any remnants of left anymore. But it really goes back to the very first cattle people, and where they already seem to have had a grasp on astronomy whenever they became cattle people. So it has to go back before that, and farming and everything, and coming out of hunter-gatherers that already had this going on, or what we believe at this point that we don't find enough remnant of to say that they were doing any type of collection. Although we found bread making devices and so on like that, like the grinding stones, going well back, almost 30,000 years at this point. But we can't tell that they had a crop right out here, or even that this naturally grew all the time and they hacked from the natural stuff that went on and it was really farming or stuff going on. But then again, barley bread, oat bread, and so on. But the same people always had an abundance each time of year, and whenever they brought their cattle in and so on, they would take this abundance and start spreading it out. It was just a concept to make sure everybody did good. And in each area, things were far apart. This wasn't Halloween trick or treat at this point, people. This was where I know there's a man that lives over that hill and about an hour or two away, and then another one that lives over, well, he's a little more to the left. In fact, if you go here, you go there, and These people are far away. It's not like you could go trick-or-treating just around the block a couple of times and near you, circling your house that was all hooked up into a grid. These people had land for their cattle and all these things, but once it was all brought together, there was a sharing that went along and trading a lot with people and so on. It was in set up for trading. So they go, I got extra gooses, so I'll hook you up for your Christmas gooses and all this other and everything. Well, I'll give you a leg of a cow for 2 gooses and this, that, and the other. And, just as an example. Anyhow, so in that idea, you have this whole thing that goes on, which again leads way back to when, all kind of concepts. But one thing that touches upon this, and it actually goes back because it's reflected in a few different generations of people in a slightly different way, but hooked up to one thing that goes back together, is this blackening of their face. Now, this has nothing to do with blackface or whatever you want to call it. This actually goes back thousands and thousands of years, and to even what seems to be close to the last ice age, where you blackened your face. Well, if you notice that a lot of sheep that they have like this have a darkened face, but they have a lighter wool that's like this going on, and so they're darkening their face like that. But also, you would camouflage your face versus a shine whenever you're night hunting, things like that, and you're going around, but also when you're protecting the flocks and so on like that. These people also, if you look at the picture, have a bunch of their cowbells on whenever they go through. It's a ringing of things, and people are coming out and so on. But of course, goat herders have all their extra goats where they're going on, but they need a lot of extra products which are going to carry them through the winter. And so there's going to be a big trade that goes along with this type of concept here. And again, this is a darkening of the face, but it really has nothing to do with the black face concept. For there's another one that's hooked up to this idea, but one of them where you make this ink and you do these drawings on yourself, which is really hooked up through what we know as of Celts as doing tattoos and so on. Some of these things are actually seasonal and not actually permanent on certain people, and people that are going through certain rites and things that are all hooked up through this ceremony here, where if you had a family member die, you're hooked up to certain ceremonies, but if you haven't in the last year or two, then you're not hooked up to those ceremonies. But depending on your age and everything that goes on, you may be hooked up to other ceremonies and other rituals and so on. So it can get pretty deep. And again, there's a covering with ash situation that goes on back then. And of course, charcoalish ash would be much darker and then light, but ash doesn't do a reflective type surface. And we've seen things like this through different cultures that go on, but this is something that's hooked up through a hunting type ritual where, again, at the end of seasons, whenever people were hunter-gatherers, we're going out and making a last final catch in groups that maybe have gotten together because of the ceremonies, and therefore ensuring that they're a catch for everybody, and not being happy with just getting one and my little group's covered, but we're going to go out as a group because we're badass, and we're going to get a few and come back. And there's a couple of groups doing this, going out to different areas they know of and so on. But then there's also, with this ghost face thing here, a ritual that comes out of this that goes with women, because there always has to be a situation, and of course something that delegates to this. But this also shows you where people have masks, and there's a person of death and stuff that goes on. But in some of these ancient rituals, it actually had the effect where this was one of these people at this ritual, which everybody's experiencing. But if you were part of the family that had a family member die, there's a younger maiden and there's an older lady that dies, which can happen, of course, during this time. And there are representatives of it, just like there are male representatives of such too, and an older guy, and whether you had a beard or not. But you might have gone to a ritual and remembered this as being somebody that's hooked up to, well, that's hooked up to Uncle George and everything. Uncle George used to look like that. No, he didn't look like that. But what you remember from, well, I guess you were 4 or 5 whenever it happened, so you probably remember this man. And Uncle George didn't really have a beard, but he was the person that was representing your Uncle George. Okay, whatever. Something along that lines, if you follow me. Trying to skip ahead a little bit too, but it's got all these rituals hooked up to it that have to do with even old chivalry and dragons and the slaying of a dragon and things like that, where if you look at this guy, he's got an ashen face or a darkened face, and you can bet somebody that was out in the Crusades that was out all day long, just like farmers would have had a very tanned face, not necessarily a body part there, would have been primarily covered up. But there are stories about that that go along with dragons, but you wouldn't think that that actually has much to do with the idea of Halloween, but it definitely does. Just like this idea of turning to darkness and the idea of darkness and light, just like you see in the Bible where light is intelligence and darkness is that. Actually, it goes back to where we're primordial creatures, well before Homo sapiens, apparently, if you want to go back real far with these concepts where you're scared of the dark and then more light, and if there's a more darker season, that's the time it's more worse. And as soon as it breaks that certain point in the veil, then you're into that. So right whenever it breaks free, if anything's been waiting, here it comes. And another effect is it's supposed to be the last time that your parents have a chance to try to get back at you and things like that. But there's a lot of giving of foods and stuff that get hooked up to this idea too, because we're supposed to take something valuable and all sacrifice it, which ended up being given to the church and then delved out to people who needed it quite often. And this is before what we think of as a church was a church, if you know what I'm saying. But in this concept, it would help people that were crippled, like you see the one guy here, and the elderly and so on that's shown there. But that concept of giving away the foods goes back a long time further, and this is the same idea that the Celts had way back whenever they fed those demons certain foods, and it was good foods too, like honeys and alcohols and all kinds of things like that, and because they were trying to appease. But this idea of crossed buns or something that is given away at a certain time of year and harvest, well, the first of harvests, showing this hooked up to everyone that was hooked up with agriculture and how far it goes back. And we have it traced now to at least about 10,000 years ago, where there were people who were getting this going, and then the spread that comes out of that into the civilizations, which we used to think were the beginnings of civilizations at 3500 BC, but that's not for the scope of this. But those people had this idea where this first harvest were given away, and if it's given to the gods, it's just burned up as smoke and given away to them because they already live in the heavens. So that idea is well before that too, but they give up this food that goes on here, and this food or special foods were given, done once per year at that Stonehenge idea and these famous circles. Well, they had trapped all the demons, and they'd be trapped forevermore. So that's why every year we have this Halloween and we give away this candy, because that's of the best of things. We don't want to make it the worst of things. And so this idea of masks, and a couple of years ago, I mean, like I've said before, I've done videos about Dracula and werewolves and everything. Mask is something else too, and it's a trickster type god that goes on, and it's hooked up through this same situation into this idea of Halloween that we've had, which this used to be a turnip, by the way, but pumpkins really hold up a whole lot longer. Although if you do one longer than a week before Halloween, you're going to have trouble having it last. And like I even said, now it's been hooked up into churches. And our church a couple of years ago knew that there was going to be storms coming into and at Halloween, they said, and it really did happen. And so the weekend prior to that, they wanted everybody to come up to the church, and they would just do a trunk type thing and dress up into your outfits if you wanted to. And of course, they do that at church right around Halloween anyhow, and everybody got to show off, but why not go ahead and do this along with it? So funny how church would adopt it whenever it's really all about Satan, but not necessarily so for their rituals that actually are connected between both of these people. And in fact, people do carvings now that are pretty special, and it shows you there's a connection there too. But that, of course, is leaving out the concept that the day after Halloween is always All Saints Day. Yeah, just like pumpkins come from turnips in the Wayback Machine, which used to look much different, but have that same guise that goes on there, and that has to do with Jack and having to do with all these concepts and ideas, and even fairy trees and the little people and this veil between dead and alive people that really we don't have necessarily so much anymore. I mean, we think about all the scary things and we put any scary story along with this idea, but you know, that was brought to us by immigrants, most of which would be in the Irish or northwestern UK European heritage that goes on. And it used to have to do with bonfires, but you know what's crazy about this is actually an end of year bonfire and barn party that these people have, and it's good enough weather. They always have a good fire big enough for people to get in a wide circle around. They get a couple of bands going, and then they get a couple of bands if they can on here and this other part over here, and they all start playing the same song together. Well, how far does that go back? Well, the Celts had that idea going on where they had like the people that make up a band in one side where they do in another too. So this is something that's hooked up to the Wayback Machine too, and somehow it gets carried on. And you can see these people dressed up into costumes, and when it comes up in the 1920s and all of that type of situation, and things change. And again, this is because of a lot of immigrants here that were going on. But I remember when I was a kid, my grandma telling a story where how far does this go back? And my mom was talking about, well, you know, there used to be these old rituals and stuff, kind of, but she didn't know much anything about it. But these old rituals, but that came through, but that got strong here about whenever my grandma was a kid or so. And my grandma said, no, it wasn't that. It wasn't even the generation before us, because this was going on. It was went on, and they had apple bobbing. And whenever I was real young, and great grandma was young, she was talking about, hey, she was young whenever, and that had been going on for a long time. And so there's a lot of things that we have in the carnivals and stuff that are all associated with this, like they were fixing to have a school carnival, and that's why we were talking about it, are there. In fact, this is a women's faculty at a school, if I'm not mistaken, and here they are wearing their witch's outfit, which was done by somebody in home and economics class, which used to be special classes for women, taught them how to sew and make things and stuff, because, you know, it's all part of this hookup, and a lot of clothing would be done between these days and the days of Christmas for certain people, and you know, and everything. And of course, that's still, clothing is a large part of it today, but we have that done in mass. Not to do anything with a witch's mass, but there are a lot of things about this idea where's the witches. One more thing about witches and this idea of these pointy hat people, which I've done other videos about, showing you it goes back to wizards and these concepts, which other people thought that knowledge meant that you must have been hooked up to the gods in heaven to know all of these things. That's witchcraft, that's magic. But, well, there's too much to talk about to fit in this video about it. This concept, going around this time, though, also hooks up to a thing that we call the Younger Dryas event. There's a meteor shower every year that happens during this time, and it's hooked up to witches. In fact, it's been called witches' brooms. And that's one of the reasons they kept tagging it as the time where these witches from this undead world apparently could make a veil through from the sky and zip through. When they did, that was zipping through on their special magic carpet, like Bewitched when you were a kid perhaps, or maybe Harry Potter and so on. But this riding of brooms, whole concept that's hooked up with this. And that actually goes back to the Younger Dryas event, where parts of apparently that same cometary mess that we keep going through a little stardust of, and every once in a while a pretty decent chunk, and each of these chunks the size of a golf ball to baseballs are making little streaks in the sky, and if they're a little bigger, making a good long streak, coming in at oblique angles. But apparently at one time part of a cometary fragment came through and did a whole lot of damage, and it spontaneously caught things on fire. And there starts being other tales too, having to do with evergreen trees and how they made it and other ones didn't. And that can lead all the way through time to the tales of Dumuzi and how there's an evergreen tree hooked up in that idea that's just like Christmas and he comes out of every year in December. But how many other cultures have this idea? Oh, there's about 6 or 8 and it spreads across the known world at that time. And so it comes from something well back, and as soon as it disappears from each of those areas, it starts to recede into a central area where, again, the same cultures that I talked about earlier in the video had come from. So this Halloween idea and death and hooked up to your ancestors. If anybody's had a person die to them soon, give a thought to it. But, you know, I've had enough family close enough to me die in enough period of time that I keep thinking about it strangely along the same lines as you would probably at Christmas or Thanksgiving when there's a plate that's missing. Well, before there was Thanksgiving, the plate that was missing was done at the Halloween Fest. It was done setting up for the idea of Thanksgiving that leads you through the Christmas time, but then they get together again and make sure people are going to make it because they're about to head to the worst part of winter. But that's for other videos, maybe around that time of year. So give it some thoughts and eat your favorites, depending on what it is. If you get a chance to go to some dance or something that's hooked up around now, or some ball or masquerade, you can also say this is hooked up with the idea. And from people that used to have soot covering their face to mask who they were because they were picked that year to do certain things, there's also an idea of people wearing masks that go back thousands and thousands of years to where you're not supposed to know who these people were. But then again, that's also a getting together of people to end up forming relationships that last a lifetime and make more kids that grow up under the idea of this whole idea of Halloween. It continues. I think it's one of the neat things. It almost died a couple of times when I was a kid because of the big scare that never really was true if you've ever looked into it. And the idea that there were needles or somebody putting something in your candy and so on. And really because everybody knew everybody in base housing, we kind of kept that going with the service kids that were growing up. And then whenever they spread out, they kept it rooted up. And then their parents knowing from when it was good before, back in the 50s and so on, before the scare really came in, helped kick it in again, and here we go. Once we were able to make cheap costumes for kids and masks and so on, that and the candy industry, which gets kicked in now worse than any time in the year, and then around holidays again too, which helps keep you fattened up through the winter, also kicked this in, so it became something a little bit different. And I just thought I'd touch upon it again this year and give another shot at it. See if I got enough room I can upload this. Peace.